Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, brought to you today by Josh Edison and Dr. M. Dentith. Hello, you're listening to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy. I am Josh Edison. In Auckland, New Zealand, they are Dr. M. Dentith in Hamilton, New Zealand. I'm locked down. How about you?
Things are free and easy here in Kiriroa. We can go out to bars, we can mingle, we can hug. We don't even have to social distance, although we should.
Yes.
We don't have to.
Whereas we wear masks but don't have to, or something, I don't know. I can work from home so I don't venture outside the house anyway.
But you have dirty children that bring the illnesses into you.
Well, that's true, yes, but not the COVID so far. I haven't been for a COVID test yet. I kind of should have, because I had a bit of a head cold, and they say if you have head cold symptoms you should get yourself tested just as a matter of course. But then the day after I woke up, the morning I woke up feeling better, like the head cold had passed, was the day we went into level 3 lockdown. And that was also the day when queues at testing facilities suddenly stretched on forever and people were spending 8 hours waiting to get tested. And I thought, I really don't want to do that. But the thing is, though, 2 years ago now, I had an operation on my sinuses. I think I must have had a week off the podcast or something when it happened. And so I've had metal fibre optic probes shoved up my sinuses and sort of curved hooky things sucking out blood clots and shit. So I kind of want to take a test just so that I can say, a cotton bud, come back to me when it's a curved metal hook. But that's probably not the best motivation.
You heard it here, folks. Josh is patient zero and he refuses to be tested.
Basically. But things have been a little more interesting for you in these times of misinformation and uncertainty and swirling conspiracy theories. You seem to have sporulated like a fungus and just sort of settled gently across the length and breadth of New Zealand's media. Where have you shown up lately? Because it's been a lot.
Well, so I've been in an article in Newsroom, which was written by Mark Delder. I appeared in a bonus episode of the 10200 podcast, an article and stuff. I was on Magic Talk Radio, and when I got to the phone call from the producer saying, "Hey, I'm a producer from Magic Talk." Now, for those of you people living overseas, Magic Talk Radio is kind of the worst of talkback in this country. And so I was afraid the producer would say, "So, Sean wants to talk to you." That would be Sean Plunkett, one of our worst broadcasters, or Peter Williams, who used to be a very respected sports broadcaster. It was turned into a terrible talkback host. But no, it was, lo and behold, it was Graham Hill, who was actually one of our better radio DJs / interviewers, because he used to have, well, probably still does, hold the whole bunch of skeptic discussions online. So I was going, oh yeah, I'll talk with Graham. Graham's great. And I'm also going to be on a podcast attached to the TV3 TV show, The Project. So basically, I've done about one media interview a day for the last week. And frankly, I'm just all over the place now. John Brennan will hate me.
Yes. Well, you heard it here first. Dr. M. Dentith is hot property. Hot media property.
It's true. I am definitely of the moment.
Yes. But we're not going to talk about any of that today. We're having another episode of Conspiracy Theory Masterpiece Theatre, and like the one of, not last time, but I think the time before, it's another short and sweet one. In fact, even
very short and sweet one.
Even shorter and sweeter than the last. So, in fact, it's so short that I'm not going to introduce it at all before the bit, because that will just eat up time that we could spend talking about the thing itself when there's little enough to talk about as it is. So I think we should just dive straight in.
Indeed. Play that sting.
Quality sting. Yes, so what we're going...
On my heart.
What we're going to be talking about today is appealing to the fundamental attribution error. Was it all a big mistake? ? By Steve Clarke, published in Conspiracy Theories, The Philosophical Debate, 2006.
Which is the first edited collection of the philosophical work on conspiracy theories, edited by David Cody. And it's quite an interesting book because it's not just pieces that had been written previously. It's also replies or expansion on those pieces. So the piece we're looking at by Steve Clarke is a response to the criticisms of his earlier paper on conspiracy theories, where he's going, look, I've been criticized about appealing to fundamental attribution error. In this chapter, I'm going to explain where I went wrong and also possibly where I might still be right. So it's quite a fascinating book because it comes out quite early in the philosophical literature on conspiracy theories. And people involved, your Lee Bashams, your Charles Pigdons, your David Cody's, your Steve Clarke, Neil Levy, whose work we'll be getting onto fairly soon. Oh dear, I got very emotional because I tried to choke myself to death. But this chapter is a reply to a reply and a slight retraction of a view.
Now, just a little recap. If you don't recall back, I think it was 9 episodes when we first talked about his first paper, Conspiracy Theories and Conspiracy Theorizing. That was the one, or one of the several ones that was a reaction to Brian L. Keeley. And it was the one where Steve Clarke, is he a Steve or a Stephen? Gives it a Steve. First of all, disagreed basically with Keeley and took quite a different tack from some of the other ones that we've seen, whereas he said that Keeley is wrong, that the things that Keeley says about his unwarranted conspiracy theories aren't really the reason why they're unwarranted. The problem with them is actually a problem with the conspiracy theorists who cling to them, and he was largely interested in these in the phenomenon of people who continue to stick to their conspiracy theories even after they don't appear to be warranted at all.
Yeah, so this is an example of someone who is very focused on the psychological nature of conspiracy theorists. So Steve doesn't deny that conspiracies occur or that conspiracy theories can be warranted. His worry is that there's a class of person out there who has a kind of irrational belief in conspiracy theories or conspiracy theorists, and he's concerned with diagnosing that problem.
Which almost sounds a little bit ad hominem-y, but I suppose it's not really. We sort of think I sort of have the knee-jerk response when you hear it. So you mean they're attacking the person, not their argument? But that's not really what's going on, is it? There's a little more in depth.
Yes, I mean it's a contentious point in the philosophical literature because it all depends on how you're defining who counts as being a conspiracy theorist. So if you follow Charles Pigden, as I do, you go, well, look, anyone who is historically or politically literate believes in not just the existence of conspiracies, but will believe at least one conspiracy theory. Ipso facto, we are all conspiracy theorists. And so the term actually applies to the general class of these things called conspiracy theories. Well, Steve is going, no, actually, when we talk about conspiracy theorists, we're talking about a particular kind of person who tend to believe conspiracy theories for bad reasons. And so if you're a Pigsonian, a Pigionator, a Pignonian, I'm trying to work out how you'd actually Pigden into... No,
Pigdenite.
If you're a follower of Dewey, you're a Deweyan. If you're a follower of Kant, you're a Kantian. So if you're a follower
Pigdinian,
of Pigeon, you're a Pigeon.
Sounds good to me.
If you're one of the people who follows Pigden on these particular issues, you go, well, no, actually, conspiracy theory isn't a conspiracy theorist isn't a pejorative term, so we shouldn't be referring to them in this kind of narrow subclass. Well, Steve is going, no, actually, when we talk about conspiracy theorists, we're talking about a rather unusual group with a psychological problem, and we need to diagnose that problem.
Now, David Cody, as we saw last time, I think, basically took issue with... Oh, no, hang on, sorry, I'm jumping ahead because, of course, the specific psychological flaw that Clarke diagnoses sort of these conspiracy theorists with is that they are committing the fundamental attribution error, which is a psychological phenomenon where people have been seen to favour dispositional explanations of things over situational explanations of things. So dispositional is more, how would you describe it, facts about people, whereas situation is facts about the situations that those people are in.
Yes, so I mean, when I do deal with this in my work, I think of disposition more with respect to the way we talk about intention. So people who favor dispositional explanations think that intentions play a much bigger role in explanations of complex social phenomena than situations people are in. Now, of course, the problem with the FAE, the Fundamental Attribution Error, is not that people don't have dispositional explanation. The question is the balance of dispositions or intention versus situation. And so as we're going to see in this discussion, the initial evidence that the fundamental attribution error applies to the case of the conspiracy theory, and thus the conspiracy theorist, may not be as easily generalizable as Clarke made it out to be in his earlier case.
No. Yes, now as I was going to say before, I forgot hadn't set up the actual main point. David Cody, when he looked at it, basically just argued against the fundamental attribution error itself. He didn't have a lot to say from what I can recall, other than to sort of kind of disagree with the evidence for it, but then also made a point, which we'll go into more shortly as we go through this, that often people who appeal to the fundamental attribution error are actually committing the fundamental attribution error themselves, so it starts to look a lot more dodgy. But I guess we should actually start talking about the paper that we're wanting to talk about today. Whose turn is it to do the abstract? Is it me or is it you?
Ooh,
I think it's me.
I haven't been... Yeah, let's just say it's you.
Let's say it's me.
Score.
Right. So the opening paragraph of the paper appealing to the fundamental attribution error, was it all a big mistake, reads, "In conspiracy theories and conspiracy theorizing, I argued that we're entitled to an attitude of prima facie skepticism to the theories propounded by conspiracy theorists. Many commentators, such as Keeley, might agree that we're entitled to such an attitude because conspiracy theorists are advocates of conspiracy theories, and they allege a significant class of conspiracy theories have fatal epistemic deficiencies. However, my approach was not to find fault with conspiracy theories, but to focus on the psychology of those conspiracy theorists who fail to abandon conspiracy theories when these theories have taken on the appearance of what Lakatos referred to as degenerating research programs." Which seemed a little, as it goes forwards, I suppose it is more accurate, but the fact that it starts with saying, characterizing Keeley as saying we're entitled to an attitude because conspiracy theorists are advocates of conspiracy theories which can be dodgy, whereas I thought the whole point was that Keeley didn't really look at conspiracy theorists at all and focused entirely on conspiracy. It seems like he's sort of casting the problem to favour his way of looking at it in the first place.
I think this also fits into a long-standing issue that people have misinterpreted Keeley to a very large extent over the course of the literature, and maybe a necessary corrective needs to be published to remind people of what Keeley actually said, as opposed to how people have misinterpreted Keeley over time.
But anyway, as he says, his approach is to focus on the psychology of the conspiracy theorists, and in particular the fundamental attribution error, or FAE as it's mostly all the way through, because that's a little bit easier, is the thing that they all have in common. That's the fallacy that they all fall into. So continuing to, and again, I think when we looked at that one, the little paper of, was it Brian Keeley, I think that we looked at a couple of times ago, that was sort of 6 pages long, and only really in the last page did he actually say something new, having summarised everything leading up to there. This one's kind of the same. It's about 3 pages long, and the actual new material comes in about halfway down the last page. So we're still sort of summarising what's come before. He says...
So there's a bit of contextualisation here. So what Clarke does in this chapter is go, look, I said the FAE is a likely candidate for explaining why we are suspicious about the psychology of conspiracy theorists. I have to now admit, speaking in Clarke's voice, that the evidence for the FAE is nowhere near as strong as I made it out to be at the time. So the first, say, 2/3 of the paper is actually the FAE isn't quite as generalizable in a broad sense as maybe I thought it was, and here's why.
Yes, yes. So he starts looking at the FAE. He says, the FAE is an error involving a bias in favour of dispositional explanations, appeal to character traits, attitudes and the like, and a corresponding bias against situational explanations. In Clarke 2002, that's his previous paper, I followed Ross and Nisbet in arguing that the FAE is a very widespread phenomenon. However, a deeper acquaintance with evidence for the FAE leads me to experience two sorts of doubts about the case for a pervasive FAE. And then, yes, as you say, he looks into the idea that maybe the fundamental attribution error isn't actually as widespread as we think it is, and therefore maybe isn't as good a candidate for explaining away unwarranted conspiracy theories.
And one of these rationales, because Clarke talked about too, is that actually it might be the choice of examples that social psychologists use which are misleading. That social psychologists tend to focus on particular situations that are of interest to them, but it's not clear that just because we find the effect in one situation, that this can be then generalized to all situations that psychological or epistemic agents experience.
Yes, so he basically looks at in the past he appealed to experimental evidence, these experiments undertaken by social psychologists, the ones about sort of, whether or not a person stops to help someone, and then whether or not they stop to help someone when they're in a hurry, and people's attitudes towards them and so on. But yes, as he says, there are sorts of situations that social psychologists are interested in, and those are the ones that they conduct experiments on, but they don't appear to have sort of looked for the FAE across what you might call a sort of broad range of human experience, across a sort of general set of situations. So maybe there isn't actually evidence to say that it's something that crops up a lot in all situations all the time. Maybe it's something that is possibly common in the scenarios that they actually look at, but not so common in other ones. And he sort of says, there's tons of experimental evidence here, lots of experience being done. He's not going to spend his time here going through them all. He just sort of points out that this does appear to be the case. And then he gets on to his second problem, where he says, and I quote, "The second problem with the case for the FAE is that there may be dispositional explanations available that can account for many of the FAE experiments which proponents of the FAE have attributed to the power of situational factors." So he's kind of, I guess, undercutting what those experiments possibly show, and that even when it looks like situational factors were the guiding thing, maybe it was actually dispositional factors all along, and people aren't making a mistake when they assume that dispositional factors are the salient ones. Am I getting that right?
Yes, so the example that he uses, which is actually Cody's criticism of Clarke, is the famous seminarian example. So this is an example which actually I remember being taught back in secondary school by, of all things, a Catholic priest in what used to be called Christian living and then became religious education, which was an experiment where a whole bunch of people training for the priesthood are told, you're about to go and attend a class on the Good Samaritan, but they're told, look, we've run over time, you're running late, you need to get to class really quickly. And so all of these trainee priests suddenly run out of class and they bypass someone who's lying on the ground and needs help. And people took this to be an example of, you put people into a particular situation of getting them to hurry from one space to another, and even though they should be primed to have the disposition, given they've been told that they're about to attend a class on the Good Samaritan, they should have the disposition to take care of people in distress they see around them. Because of the situation they're in, they rush past. And as Cody points out, and as many critics of the FAE have pointed out, there actually might be a disposition in operation there, which is it's rude and embarrassing to be late. So the disposition of hurrying to class is actually part of, the situation of hurrying to class also carries with it the disposition, I don't want to be embarrassed. And thus that actually might be playing the role. Now, the argument here isn't that the disposition trumped the situation. The argument here is we don't know exactly what's going on in this situation. If you only cast it in situational factors, then you can bring the disposition in. In the same respect, if you cast the entire story as a dispositional explanation, someone could say, but what about the situation? We literally don't know what's going on here.
He also points out in a footnote that the fundamental attribution error seems to be more of a Western phenomenon, and that similar experiments in other cultures don't necessarily show the results that we've seen in our cultures. And I know this is something I know very little about the field of psychology and experimentation and so on, but I've heard it said that it's a problem in psychology with these sorts of experiments that they tend to not have a super representative sample, and that a lot of these experiments are conducted at universities, and therefore their subjects are university students because they're the ones who are nearby and willing to participate, and university students aren't necessarily a representative cross-section of society. I know there's that project, isn't there, of trying to replicate the results of famous experiments, and they've had fairly patchy success in the past.
Yes, there is what's called the replication crisis going on in psychology at the moment, because yes, a lot of the famous experiments are meant to show X applies to psychological agents, either have never been tested again, or it turns out that when you look at the tests or the replications are, as you say, small sample sizes made up of university students, and thus not generalizable to the entire human population. And when you start testing bigger sample sizes, which are more diverse, the effect that people saw in controlled environments often ends up being a lot more amorphous than people initially thought.
So, yeah, the FAE is starting to look a little more shaky, and then he gets to the point that David Cody himself basically took issue with appeals to the FAE, and pointed out in his paper one of the things, as we said, that often you can look at when people appeal to the fundamental attribution error, you can often sort of point to dispositional issues that lead them to come to that conclusion in the first place, and often you could make the case that people who overly appeal to the FAE are in fact committing the fundamental attribution error themselves, and says that there's always a mixture of situation and disposition, and it's quite murky as to exactly how much of each is in play at any one time. So to the point where he says, where Clarke says, Cody is of course right that possible explanations of behaviour should appeal to a combination of situation and dispositions. This sensible view is not disputed by me or even by staunch situationists such as Ross, and my apologies to readers if the brief sketch of the case for the FAE presented in his previous paper led them to think otherwise. So it's starting to look a little more shaky for the fundamental attribution error. Does this mean then that his initial view in his paper is becoming more and more shaky?
Well, so therein lies the issue, because Steve wants to have it that he was wrong to rely heavily on the FAE, but at the same time he still thinks he's largely right if we make certain assumptions.
So he doesn't, while he admits that the FAE is less cut and dried, less absolute than it certainly appeared as he presented it in his original paper, he doesn't think that this invalidates his previous argument, especially if you cast his argument as the important factor that explains why people cling to unwarranted conspiracy theories is not to do with conspiracy theories themselves, it's to do with the psychology of the conspiracy theorists. Now, he says that it's not a problem in one of two ways. Either you could say that, okay, the fundamental attribution error isn't as widespread as we thought, But that simply shows that these conspiracy theorists who are committing the fundamental attribution error are the exception to the rule, which is kind of what we thought anyway. So he has that as one possibility, or then he admits, okay, or maybe the FAE just doesn't apply. Maybe the whole project is wrong. But in that case, he still suggests that it's another psychological factor that's behind their behaviour. He says, I argue that the apparent implausibility of those conspiracy theories that are popularly propounded is best explained by appealing to the psychology of conspiracy theorists. I don't... I sort of get to this point and I'm like, well, I don't know enough about psychology to say either way. Do philosophers know enough about psychology to say either way? Or should we just leave this to the psychologists?
Wow. So a lot of this does depend on your definitions, because the assumption that Clarke relies upon for this conclusion that either the FAE is in play, but conspiracy theorists are the exception rather than the rule, or there is some other psychological explanation is able to explain why people believe conspiracy theories, is kind of based upon this line he has that, look, conspiracy theorists are in the minority for now, and that for now part is important. So he's going, look, we're restricting talk of belief in conspiracy theories to a very small, problematic belief in conspiracy theories, to a very small set of people, the pejoratively labeled conspiracy theorists, which we can see with our examples of, say, your David Icke, your Alex Joneses, your Billy P.K. Jr., and the like. And we need to explain why it is that they are unusual and weird, and the best way to do that is via their psychology. But that requires you to buy into a pejorative gloss as to who counts as being a conspiracy theorist. If you open the franchise of conspiracy theorists, just anyone who believes in a conspiracy theory, this psychological account isn't going to work, because there's warranted belief in conspiracy theories, and there are examples of things that have been labeled as conspiracy theories, and thus the people who believe them labeled as conspiracy theorists. That turned out to be things we ought to have believed in the first instance. So we can kind of sidestep the do we need to engage with the psychologists here by going, actually, an awful lot is reliant upon who counts as being a conspiracy theorist in this particular type of argument.
Now, would it be fair to say that Clarke is a generalist rather than a particularist? I mean, he certainly seems to be saying that the content of the conspiracy theories is almost irrelevant next to the category of people who believe in them.
I would say that Clarke actually still is a particularist, insofar that he does believe that conspiracy theories can be warranted. He is a kind of generalist when it comes to conspiracy theory. So he does take it that whilst we can't just assume things about things that are labelled as conspiracy theories because conspiracies occur, he is willing to bite the bullet and say, if you've been labelled as a conspiracy theorist, then that is a general class of people who act irrationally. So, and the reason why I say this is, I know Steve, I've corresponded with Steve. At one point earlier this year, we were working on a research proposal around COVID-19 conspiracy theories. And I thus know what he thinks about the conspiracy theories as opposed to the conspiracy theorists. He was willing to work with me on a project looking at how we analyze COVID-19 conspiracy theories to try and have an evidential debate about which ones we ought to take seriously and which ones we might have a rationale for putting to one side. So I don't think he can end up being a generalist about conspiracy theories, but I do think he ends up being a generalist about these people called conspiracy theorists.
Because I do recall from his previous paper, he said at the end something to the effect of, and it's probably worth putting up with all these degenerative research programs and so on, because eventually they do come up with one that is real, and it's important that we find out about these real things like Watergate. So am Am I inviting spoilers if I say how have things gone from here? Have his views evolved much? Have people responded to things, or will we get into those responses in the fullness of time?
Well, we're not going to see much more of Clarke. We're going to see one more paper by Clarke, Conspiracy Theories and Controlled... Conspiracy Theories and the Internet, which has a subtitle about controlled demolition, which is actually going to be an analysis of how conspiracy theories have done in the online world. But by and large, after that, Steve kind of leaves the literature. But I do believe he's quite keen to get back into it. And I say that because I did invite him to be a contributor to Taking Conspiracy Theories Seriously, published back in 2018. And initially he was quite keen. And then he did some background reading and went, look, I need to do more reading of the current state of the literature before I can contribute. But I think he's quite interested in doing that. So we'll have one more paper by Clarke, and I suspect we'll have more papers by Clarke in future.
Well, there you go. Now, that one references controlled demolition, so I assume at that point people have finally started talking about 9/11 in earnest.
Oh, yeah.
I did actually...
Very interesting comparison between 9/11 and JFK conspiracy theories.
I finally found out the other day, Loose Change came out in 2007, so even this paper, which was published in a book in 2006, predates the documentary that really started the...
Which version of Loose Change? Is that the first edition of Loose Change?
I assume it was.
3.
Yeah, that's a point, yes. I just read a thing that talked about Loose Change, which came out in 2007, but I assume that must be the first one. But Loose Change was certainly the...
has narration by Charlie Sheen. Back when he was famous.
Yes, Loose Change being sort of the plandemic, I guess, of 9/11, which really kicked things off. But anyway, that is it for appealing to the fundamental attribution error. Was it all a big mistake? And in keeping with the fact that supposedly any headline, any title you read that has a question in it can always be answered with no, that's pretty much what Steve Clarke does. So good, I guess. No surprises.
Indeed. That does bring us to an end of another exciting episode of Conspiracy Theory Masterpiece Theatre. So for those of you who aren't patrons, you'll need to wait until next week for what might be an exciting installment of Podcaster's Guide to Conspiracy. But for our patrons, well, we've got some humdinger material for you. We'll be talking about David Farrier, talking about Dylan Reeve, talking about the originator of a dodgy COVID-19 outbreak rumor in this country. We'll be hearing from Byron Clark about Kerry Bolton recording yet another podcast episode with Action Zealandia. We'll be checking in on the Senate Intelligence Committee report on Russian interference in the last US election, which has some startling conclusions for fans of Donald Trump. We'll be asking questions about why Jerry Brownlee continues to ask questions. And finally, there's a brand new Bertha theory. I can't say it. Finally, there's a brand new Bertha theory in US politics.
Hooray.
In the notes, I haven't written Jerry Brownlee, I've written Jerry Brownless.
Jerry Brownless. Well, I mean, that's true, I guess. Not much brown on him that I'm aware of.
No, he's actually one of the whitest men.
He's quite a white person. Yes, so if you're a patron, stick around and you can get into some of that straight away. If you're not a patron but you'd like to be one, then go to Patreon and look for the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, and that would be just peachy. Would indeed. Happy to have you on board. Not only would you get access to these bonus episodes, you can also go on our Discord and send us messages and basically tell us what to do and how to run our lives, essentially. I'm pretty sure you get that right once you've signed up as a patron. You can even actually listen in live to the recording of these episodes and find out about all the crap that we do in between takes and find out when we mess stuff up and have to do it again. We can't hide anything from you. So yeah, I that's the best selling of it I can do, I think. If
Me, if it made sense to contribute to my own podcast, I'd be.
But if I haven't convinced you and you don't want to become a patron, that's fine also. We're quite happy to just have you as our audience, to be perfectly honest. But to you, our audience, we have no more to say this week. I think that was quite a quick episode, wasn't it? Like we said, short and sweet.
Actually, it's still going to be around about 40 minutes in length.
Oh, well, there we go. We do like to waffle, don't we?
We do.
Well, let's cut it short anyway, no matter the final length. Call things to a close and simply say goodbye from me.
And it's hello from me.
Confronting.
You've been listening to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, starring Josh Addison and Dr. M.R.X. Denton, which is written, researched, recorded and produced by Josh and M. You can support the podcast by becoming a patron via its Podbean or Patreon campaigns. And if you need to get in contact with either Josh or M, you can email them at podcastconspiracy@gmail.com or check their Twitter accounts, Monkey Fluids and Conspiracism. And remember, it's just a step to the left.